Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Our guest tonight is Kiran Grewal. She's a lawyer, scholar, activist in the areas of transitional justice, gender-based violence, torture prevention. Good evening and welcome to the show, Kiran.
Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome to Sri Lanka. Good to have you here with us. Kiran, most recently the government cabinet approval was granted for the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Sri Lanka, and the government specifically gave undertakings to the effect that this commission will operate independently and it will act in a bid to instill confidence among the people. However, time and time again, we have seen measures being taken in post-conflict Sri Lanka following the conclusion or the military conclusion of the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka in 2009. The LLRC report, the Missing Persons Commission, there was a consultative task force appointed with recommendations, comprehensive recommendations, which were not fully implemented. These are just a few of the initiatives that were taken by successive governments to look into the transitional justice discourse in the country. Do you think the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the feasible next step for Sri Lanka as a scholar, as a practitioner, as someone who has worked in other post-conflict scenarios like Sierra Leone and Kosovo? What are your opening remarks?
Well, I think, as you have already pointed out, Sri Lanka is not new to the transitional justice game, and there have been, even going back to the 1990s, various commissions of inquiry. I think without the government showing some commitment to actually implementing any of the previous recommendations, I think it will be very hard to get people on board and supportive of yet another institution. Not least the survivors who have already had to tell their stories many times, have already said what they are seeking and haven't been given it. I think there's a lot of cynicism around why now, what this institution is supposed to do and whose benefit it's actually for.
When we take the concept of transitional justice, there are 4 identified pillars: truth-telling, justice, reparations, and non-recurrence. So setting up of a TRC, or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, will fall under the first pillar, where survivors and victims will have a forum where they could tell their story. Right now, we saw it happening in the South African scenario, where Archbishop Desmond Tutu chaired the commission, and it was incredible to watch deeply moving scenes of survivors coming out with their stories. It was televised, not just in South Africa, but across the world. Do you think this kind of TRC could succeed in the Sri Lankan context? Because in the South African context, it was more of a forgiveness-based Christian conception of forgiveness that was implemented, but that can't be superimposed to the Sri Lankan context. So how do you see the differences?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that we could say about that. One, I would say, I am not sure that Sri Lanka is ready yet to actually hear some of the truths. I mean, if we just think about how contentious it's been to even mark the final stage of the war, every year there is that tension between the call by survivor communities to actually be able to commemorate and an incredible fear, it seems, on the part of the authorities to actually let that be done. So I think that there is a lot that is still unspoken and maybe can't still be spoken about. So with a truth commission, whether or not the conditions are there for people's truths to be heard and,
Right.
and recognised, I'm not sure. The other thing I would say, which is probably on the other side of this, would be, yes, I think the South African Truth Commission relied very much on the sort of Christian philosophy. I think that Sri Lanka has some very powerful resources to draw on in terms of Buddhist philosophy, for example. So I think that if there was a genuine will to actually listen to uncomfortable truths, for people to be able to speak, and for sort of discussions to be had about the question of forgiveness, I think that there are local indigenous resources that could be drawn on. I recently watched the film Pangshu by Visakesa Chandrasekaram about the southern insurrection, and that movie is all about forgiveness. And the difficulties of telling difficult stories, and it very much draws on sort of Buddhist symbols and mythology to sort of give us some language to speak about the possibility of forgiveness here. So I think that it is possible, but I think it comes back to the question of whether or not there is political will to open up the space to actually have what might be a very difficult and unpleasant conversation if we're really to hear all the stories that exist out there.
Kiran, just as you alluded, Sri Lanka has had a bloody past. The 1970s insurrection, the 1980s insurrection, to the conflict, which was brought to a halt in 2009. And a common trait with all these three is that the accountability mechanism or the transitional justice mechanism wasn't properly implemented. So people never properly healed. It was just sort of forgotten about. So when you don't come to terms with your wrongs as a society, you repeat them. In light of the fourth pillar of transitional justice, which is guarantees of non-recurrence, speak to us about the importance of Sri Lankans recognizing the need to implement a transitional justice mechanism that could very well be painful, but is so needed.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that would be really important with this Truth Commission, if and when it gets up and running, is to think very carefully about what sort of period of time it would be looking at. Because one of the lessons that was learnt in the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that much of the most extreme violence in Sierra Leone's civil war had roots in older forms of oppression.
Right.
And so they took a very broad view of the history that needed to be covered in order to be able to actually understand and address the violence of the war. I think in the case of Sri Lanka, it would be very hard to do justice to all that Sri Lanka has been through without taking a long view of the history, exactly as you say. I mean, we could take this right back to independence. And I think without recognising all of those different periods of state violence, of political violence in the country, of the connectedness of victim groups and perpetrator groups, that I think we will, if we only deal with one period of history, we will get a very skewed picture. So that would be the first thing that I think we need it to take a long view.
Right.
I think also that question about, whether or not this past can be buried, I think, as you've just suggested, we can see that it's not been buried. It keeps rearing its head. And I would say, even if you look post 2009, if you look at the number of times where we have seen attacks on Muslim communities, and of course the Easter bombings and the response to the Easter bombings, the kind of underlying issues of how the society lives together and deals with tensions when they arise between communities has to be addressed, because otherwise it will just keep coming up in different forms. I think at the same time, one of the reasons why having that long view of history will be really useful is, sometimes I get very frustrated when people talk about Sri Lanka as an ethnic conflict. Yes, of course, there has been a particular history in relation to the war that ended in 2009 that pitted Tamil community and the Sinhalese state against each other. But I think the kind of underlying causes of political violence in Sri Lanka are more complicated than this being just about a Sinhala Tamil issue. So I think whatever institution was to come along would need to be very mindful of recognizing, well, how do we make sense of the fact that the state has also used violence against the Sinhala population in the south? How do we understand why post-Easter attacks we see Tamil nationalists and Sinhala nationalists coming together against the Muslim community? So I think until we sort of break down why political violence has been considered so useful in this context, I don't think that we'll move out of the possibility of recurrence. And I think if we only adopt a very simplistic view of this being a problem of ethnicity or religion, I think we'll miss something very important. And so that would be my hope, that whatever institution does get set up is actually prepared to dig a bit deeper into these questions and not have a sort of very superficial analysis of, who the victims are, who the perpetrators are, and what the reasons for violence have been.
It's also of pivotal importance that institutional structures and frameworks hold the confidence of not just the majority community, but also the minority communities, the marginalized communities, the victimized communities. This is a very difficult task. How must the state overcome this obstacle?
That is a very difficult question, and I think, unfortunately, the state is not starting in a very good position, precisely because while there has been an interest by victim groups and survivor groups and different communities in participating with state institutions in response to past violence, I think a lot of the goodwill has run out. So, if you think many people came and testified and participated in the LLRC process, many more people came and testified and participated in the consultation task force hearings. So for many of those people, I think they would feel like we have put ourselves out there. Often, people have often said that they have faced intimidation, they've faced unpleasant authorities who are very unsympathetic or indifferent to their issues. So with all of that, they still came out and spoke, and they feel like nothing has happened with that. So for them to have faith that this time will be different, the state is going to have to do some very hard work proving that. And I think even, one of the ways in which the consultation task force was so successful was because it had these zonal task forces that relied very much on trusted figures from within the local civil society and the local community in the different districts. And so as a result of those people being involved, people were willing to trust and come out. A lot of those people, the civil society community leaders from the different districts, feel very burnt themselves, that they asked people to come out and speak, nothing happened with it. So I think for the state to be able to find people from the different communities and from civil society who are going to be willing to participate in this process again is going to be hard.
However, ultimately, Kiran, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has to be something that fits the Sri Lankan context, as we discussed. Initially, the South African model sort of provided for the world a blueprint on how a Truth and Reconciliation Commission can look like. And based on those learnings, the Sierra Leone TRC was set up, which also included the prosecution's aspect. If you could elaborate on that.
Yes, so there are sort of various things that now looking back on the South African Truth Commission we can say are lessons learned. So I mean there was a very particular time, the experience of being post-apartheid. I think the ways in which the South African government tried to reimagine what the state should look like and reimagine how the society would live together is, incredible. But now looking back, I think there are many criticisms as well of that process. One of those being that in order for people to have a sense of justice, it can't be enough just to have people, the perpetrators, acknowledge what they've done. But for many people, they want something more than that. And so in the case of Sierra Leone, it was felt that while a Truth Commission would be very helpful to ask those sort of longer questions, as I said, to sort of pick up on what might have been the root causes of conflict, and gives space for a wider array of voices to be heard and recorded in order for the sort of story of the nation to be told, that alongside that there needed to be at least those who were considered most responsible for the worst atrocities to be held accountable in some way, which is why in Sierra Leone they opted to also have trials in which they prosecuted, I think there were 10 in the end, 10 of the sort of leaders of the different factions who stood trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So that was one lesson, that for many people truth-telling is one part of the story, but also people want some sense that justice has been done as well. The other thing that I think people have learnt from the South African example is that while there is something very important about the sort of symbolic recognition of what people went through, that for many people in South Africa, the biggest issue post-apartheid continues to be the biggest issue for them now, and that is economic issues, poverty, lack of access to land and resources, lack of basic necessities. And so I think for many people, the lesson from South Africa was that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was important, but it needed to be accompanied by maybe some sort of criminal justice, but also definitely some sort of economic justice. And I think, that's an important lesson that can also be learnt here in Sri Lanka, because certainly, my experience of going out and talking to, many marginalised communities all over the country, but particularly in the north and east, has been that for many of them, issues around land, getting their land back, being able to resettle in their own home places, making sure that they still have access to the resources that they need, like water and other basic necessities, livelihoods. All of these are really pressing questions, and they are as pressing a question as any sort of symbolic recognition of the harm that they've suffered.
We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
Are starting to run high.
Biggest rivalries in the history of sport.
Some as bad as they could.
Pride, passion, everything at stake.
And every time they clash against each other, this is the scenario that we get. Some as bad as they could. All pumped up. Emotions all around. There is some tension in the middle. Some as bad as they could. Big game. So much anticipation. A real confrontation in the middle.
Asia Cup, watch live on TV1.
මන්ද පෝෂණය කියන දේ අපේ රටට බලපාලා තියෙනවද?
මන්ද පෝෂණය රටට බලපාලා තියෙනවා. මේ පිළිබඳ දත්තක් තියෙනවා.
කාට හරි හිතෙන්න පුළුවන් මගේ හැම කැතයි මට ඕනේ සුදු පාට හැමක් කියලා.
අපි දේක ප්‍රතිඵලය විතරක් නොබලා එහි ආරක්ෂිත බව ගැනත් හිතන්න. එතටම අපි කියන්නේ ලස්සනට ඉන්න එපා කියලා. අපි කියන්නේ ආරක්ෂා සහිතව ලස්සනට ඉන්න.
පිළිකා රෝගියෙක් පිළිකා ප්‍රතිකර්ම වලදී පෝෂණය කියලා කියන්නේ මම හිතන්නේ වැදගත් සාධකයක් බවට පත් වෙනවා.
පිළිකාව කියන රෝගයත් එක්කම ඕනම කෙනෙක් මන්ද පෝෂණ තත්වයකට පත් වෙනවා. කන්න අපිට දැන් තියෙන සාමාන්‍ය තියෙන පිරිය වුණත් අඩු වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ලොකු හේතු ගණනාවක් තියෙනවා. සාමාන්‍ය කෙනෙකුට වඩා මේ රෝගියාට ගන්න පුළුවන් ආහාර මට්ටමත් අඩු වෙනවා.
කතාවයි ක්‍රියාවයි අතර වෙනස. ජාතික මෙහෙවර. සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 9ට.
Welcome back. We're in conversation with Kiran Grewal. Kiran, I'd like to speak about the intersectionality between transitional justice and gender. We see the manner in which women have been at the forefront of post-conflict Sri Lanka. From women-headed households to the protests of the mothers of the disappeared, to demanding the state for action, for justice. Speak to us about this aspect.
Well, I mean, I think it's ironic that what often happens is that it is women who are on the streets amongst the most active, both in terms of rejecting war and also making demands for some sort of justice in relation to survivors of war or victims of war. But often when it comes to the sort of formal institutions, women are underrepresented and their voices are underheard.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, looking at Sri Lanka, if you think about how many thousands of days the mothers of the disappeared have now been in the streets in the north of the country and the east of the country, I mean, it's quite remarkable the sort of strength that they have shown. So I think that we need to make sure that any sort of response, transitional justice response, takes seriously the role that women have played both during the conflict in terms of being voices against the violence, also in the post-conflict period, the sort of additional pressures that women may face, as you say, whether it's as female-headed households, whether it's the mothers of the disappeared who, continue to search for their loved ones, but also as really important actors. And I mean, this is one of the things that the UN sort of tried to recognise back in 2000 with Security Council Resolution 1325, that was supposed to be about women, peace and security, the role that women have to play in peace processes and sort of post-conflict processes. And yet, time and again, we see women being sort of sidelined in these processes. I mean, I guess there are a number of things to say about the role that women play. One is acknowledging them as actors and listening to the sorts of demands that they make. Also, whether or not, without essentializing some kind of different feminine approach to a masculine approach to politics, whether in greater inclusion of women might change the nature of the political discourse a little bit. And so, I would like to see that really at the heart of the political process. And I know many different women's groups have been pushing very hard to make sure that there is better women's representation at all levels of government. So I think that is another important part of this story.
Right.
But also, I think, the question that always arises is when we're thinking about the sort of harms that are responded to as a result of war or other types of human rights violations, whether or not we recognise that these harms are often gendered and that women may experience these harms differently to men.
Right.
And so making sure that whatever sort of justice process we see going forward has a place to recognise the importance of gender as it impacts on men and as it impacts on women.
Earlier on in the program, we spoke about the importance of political will. Whatever mechanism that is brought in towards ensuring justice has to be survivor-centered, and also there needs to be clarity and specificity on what exactly is entailed. If I could hear your thoughts on this.
So I was recently reading a very interesting book by an Indian-Ugandan scholar called Mahmood Mamdani, and he wrote a book that came out last year about post-colonial states that have experienced violence. And so he writes about a number of different case studies, including South Africa. And one of the things he concludes is that there is little point in going straight to criminal justice if you don't have political justice. I would add to that economic justice as well. And so for Mamdani, he thinks that South Africa was a good model because he feels that rather than just having, some sort of trials of just a few people, which can, on the one hand, sort of scapegoat a few people and leave the rest of the society sort of unchanged, and or can feed a sense of victimization by all sides. And I think that's a real risk in the Sri Lankan context. Whenever people ask me how I feel about criminal prosecutions, I say, on the one hand, I can see why there might be a need to do that, but I also think it would be very unhelpful to do that without some kind of broader political justice in the process, because I think otherwise you will feed a narrative that already exists amongst, the majority community, that they are being unfairly targeted, their men, their soldiers, their heroes are being unfairly targeted. And on the other side, you will also have a resistance possibly from within the Tamil community to naming and speaking about atrocities or violence that may have occurred within the community. So I think criminal justice on its own without political justice is unhelpful. Then in terms of the political justice question, which I think goes to the point you're raising, is what does political justice mean in this context? So on the one hand, I would say, well, if we look at the kinds of recommendations that have been made time and time again, some of the answers are already there, I think, of the sorts of things that people want to be done differently going forward. And, certainly things like getting rid of the executive presidency, thinking much harder about what devolution of power might look like. We've seen the 13th Amendment hasn't kind of, with the establishment of provincial councils, hasn't delivered everything it was supposed to. I think we need to revisit why that is the case and what else might be done. Other things around kind of re-establishing transparency and accountability within institutions. I think a lot of those recommendations are already there, and I think if there was some move towards implementing some of those, that would lead us closer to political justice. But then I think there's something else which also needs to be acknowledged, and this is where, talking about the sort of survivor or victim-centred approach, one of the things that I've been really interested in over the last, so I started working in Sri Lanka in 2012, and very much from a sort of lawyer institutional approach, and over the years I've drifted more and more into sort of anthropology, really, even though I'm not a trained anthropologist. But I became really aware that a lot of the kind of language that is used within institutional settings and even within sort of elite civil society around transitional justice, around human rights, it is a language that is not easily translating into the community. It's not necessarily resonating with people. And often the response to that is we need to train people more, we need to teach them about human rights, we need to teach them transitional justice. I think that's the wrong approach. I actually think that just because these languages are not resonating with people doesn't mean that communities around Sri Lanka don't have their own very clear views of what justice would mean, what peace might mean, what reconciliation might look like. They have their own languages for that. They have their own practices for that. It is happening at local levels. We're just not tapped into it. So I think for me, the quest of political justice would also be expanding our ability to hear other types of discourses around what people want, maybe looking beyond the kind of usual spaces of institutional settings and elite civil society, and looking at, well, what are communities actually saying in their local temples, in the kinds of community art forms that they're engaging in. How would we see those as sites where another type of political discourse is also going on? And maybe some of the ideas that would come through there might actually also be really useful in rethinking what political justice would look like here beyond just institutional reform.
Absolutely. Kiran, in terms of prioritization of objectives in a Sri Lanka that is going through an economic crisis at the moment, there is a conception that, look, the priority right now is to get Sri Lanka back on track in terms of its economic goals, in terms of the IMF undertakings. And every single time it has been one thing or the other. There is no societal understanding of the urgency for a transitional justice mechanism, a healing mechanism. Nobody realizes the importance of this. You're a trained professional, a scholar in transitional justice, which is why you understand the nuances and the implications of what could happen if it's not implemented. But the common man doesn't know this information. Like you said, it doesn't resonate. What do we do?
That's a really difficult question. I mean, I think that what we have to recognize is that there is a vested interest in maintaining transitional justice as this destabilizing idea.
Yeah.
You know, even last year when we saw the protest movements that arose as a result of the economic crisis, that seemed to open up a little moment where, because the economic crisis was hitting across communities, that was a real moment of potential for building solidarity across communities.
Yeah.
And yet we saw a number of times efforts to try and scapegoat, to divide communities. Now, looking at who those actors were that wanted to do that, it's the same actors that maintain the status quo also in terms of the economic system, the political system. They benefit from Sri Lanka being in this situation.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I feel like it's sad that last year, while it seemed to open up the possibility for some really major reforms happening, not just politically but economically, that unfortunately that seems to have just been crushed again. And we see the same kind of tactics being used now to maintain these tensions within communities. So, for example, you know, some of the things that are currently happening in the north of the country around sort of trying to establish a kind of Buddhicization of the north of the country. I mean, that to me seems quite clearly to be trying to stoke fires.
Yeah.
So I think for ordinary people, it really is about how much they are starting to see that the interests that are being served by maintaining these ideas of constantly at odds communities, rather than communities that are actually really very closely related to each other in terms of many of the kind of economic struggles that people are facing. I think if people can start to see that they are being manipulated to maintain these divides, I think actually transitional justice wouldn't be such a threatening thing. But I think, you know, maybe the problem is, again, if we keep using this seemingly quite alien language of transitional justice. I mean, I remember a friend talking to me about how, you know, when when they were trying to translate transitional justice into Sinhala and Tamil in 2015, the difficulties, because it doesn't mean anything. I mean, even in English, it doesn't have a particular meaning. So I think, you know, we can have all of this infrastructure around transitional justice, but I think what's more important is trying to have those conversations at the community level about what are the kind of common problems. You know, I've been talking to farmers in Polonnaruwa and in Hambantota, and when you speak to the farmers, I mean, actually, many of them are very sensitive to the fact that many of the problems they have, they recognise that people in the north and east also have. Women who are experiencing problems with microfinance and the debt burden of that. Many of them spoke very sympathetically about, we know that, our fellow citizens in the north and east must be suffering even more because of the war. So I think at the community level, there is an awareness that there are things that bring people together. And I think rather than us having to go through this apparently imposed language of transitional justice, maybe the more important work is really at that grassroots community level, building a sense that the problems that you might be having in Monaragala are not that dissimilar to the problems that someone might be having in Mulletivu. And I think if we could start on that basis, of course then we still have to deal with the result of the war. We have to deal with, the fact that there has been state racism and certain minority communities have suffered at the hands of the state and of the majority community, realistically. But I think that will be a less antagonistic conversation if we first start to work around what actually are very common experiences at the local level.
Who will build these bridges between communities?
Well, I think that, I'm seeing it at the level of local community activists. I can think of, in a couple of instances, Hamadru that I know in different parts of the country who've done important work, as people who have the kind of the social standing and the respect of the community, to reach out and make those connections across community. I think, for example, the Batiklo Justice Walk, and that has been going now 460-something days, and the kinds of conversations that I've heard happening in Batiklo that are trying to recognise that, there's an importance of, say, the Muslim and Tamil community in Batiklo speaking to each other and coming together. So I think it's very much happening at the very local level, and I think supporting some of that is really important.
Right.
Unfortunately, I don't think it's happening enough at the level of politicians and political actors, and that's where I think, we need to do probably some more work with the population around thinking, I think there's a great cynicism amongst ordinary people about politicians. It's the same, I think it's the same globally. I think many of us have had enough of politicians and think that they are, not speaking in the interests of common people. So if that's the case, then how do we, as voters, how can we change that?
Right.
What would that look like? So I think some of that work needs to be done. But in the meantime, I think a lot of work is happening at the grassroots community level, and I think that we need to be paying attention to what's happening at that level and supporting that as much as we possibly can.
All right. Despite the cynicism, Sri Lankans have to have that faith in the structures that are set up. So people also need to then help out and converge. So looking at the setting up of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a hopeful and positive manner, what steps must we take societally?
Well, I read a very interesting article from one of the Sri Lankan newspapers, the retired Justice
Rohini Marasinghe.
Yeah,
yes.
I found her article very interesting. And I think she actually visited Sierra Leone and spoke to a number of the people involved with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there. And I think she has some very useful recommendations about the importance of public consultation, the importance of really getting buy-in from people themselves, so that they feel that they have ownership over this process. But then that has to be delivered on. We can't just have consultation again without that being reflected in what happens going forward. Otherwise, people will lose faith. And I think, having prominent figures like her involved and other respected figures from, the judiciary, from the human rights community, getting behind it, I think will obviously add to the status of the institution. I see that, there are a number of new human rights commissioners that have been appointed to the Human Rights Commission. So I think, having some new faces and using the sort of standing that they have in the community to get behind this, I think would help. But I also think that I would rather see the institution itself take a little bit more time, but a commitment really be shown at the level of the grassroots community to taking seriously what they have to say, because I think if you can build that confidence at the community level and they can see that something is that they are being listened to, I think that will make a huge difference, rather than it being something that, as it currently seems to look, that it's going to be kind of imposed from the state.
Yeah.
You know, and have this sort of
Top-down.
top-down approach. I think that will mean it becomes another instrument that doesn't really produce anything, unfortunately.
My final question to you, speak to us about the importance of community engagement and Sri Lankans taking ownership of the transitional justice discourse in Sri Lanka.
Well, I think that's absolutely the key question, and I think one of the things that has been really positive since last year, I know many people felt quite disillusioned by last year, but I think one of the things that's been really positive is there has been an active conversation about people's power.
Yeah.
And about the importance of democracy, not just as a set of institutions, but as a set of practices. And we've seen this with things like, the attempts to establish people's councils in different parts of the country. There have been people's parliament initiatives, other types of people's forums. So I think the fact that conversation is happening right now is really positive. And certainly, I've spoken to groups pretty much across almost every every province of Sri Lanka now, about these local level sort of people's assemblies. And what I keep hearing over and over again is the importance of it being very sensitive to the context of the particular place, it being a place where people can really come together and have frank conversations, and learn to engage in some sort of deliberative democracy process. So the fact that experiment is happening right now all around the country, and the fact that people are engaged in that process, I think is really positive. So if we can kind of tap into some of that energy and maybe turn some of these people's initiatives into something that also feeds into transitional justice processes, I think that there's real hope there.
Beautiful. Kiran Grewal, thank you so much for your time, your perspectives. Thank you for watching us. Have a safe weekend. Good night.